Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Opinion Machine, the show where we talk about all things gaming. My name is Killjoy, and today we're going to be talking about Super Mario RPG, the remake on Switch, a game that I have recently finished. And to give context on this, I had played a little bit of the original SNES version back in the day, and I didn't really like it. Couldn't get into it at the time. I didn't really like RPGs. I probably wasn't very good at them. But I recently bought and played through all of this game. Didn't do everything in it. Haven't really done the post-game content or anything like that. But I wanted to have a crack at it. Paper Mario Thousand Year Door's coming out soon. And I thought, I've got time to play this before it's out. So I thought I'd give it a try. And I've got to say, as I've gotten a bit older, I kind of like games that are a little bit on the shorter side, kind of a bit more to the point. And that's kind of what Super Mario RPG is. It's not a particularly long game. I did it in about 12 hours of gameplay, almost maybe 12 and a half hours of gameplay, which was shorter than I was expecting it to be. I was thinking it might be more of a 15-hour game, but, like I said, I didn't do everything. I don't know if I did all the mini games, definitely haven't done all the post-game content, but I had an absolute blast with this game. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that this game is perfect by any means, but I think it was just playing this at the right time, and I really got a lot out of it. So let's just sort of go over the usual things about it. First off, the graphics of this game are very, very much improved versions of how the SNES game looked. It's an isometric game, which does have its own problems when it comes to platforming, but for the most part, it's an isometric game with a very bright, colourful style. All the characters have got a squish look to them. It's got a sort of a cuteness to it. And most of the areas you go to are bright and colourful, and they have nice palettes, and honestly, the game does a really good job of updating that graphics, but giving it a modern rendition similar to what was there on the SNES. So that's really cool. I really, really enjoyed that. A lot of the different areas, you've got what's meant to be the Mushroom Kingdom, which is a town. You've got Bowser's Castle, you've got the Mole, the hill, or whatever it's called. You've got Star Road, you've got all these different places, and every single place has its own unique vibe to it. And like I said, it's very bright and colourful. You've got a volcano that's very dark and full of reds and oranges and stuff like that. So in terms of the game's look and overall style and overall just sort of graphic fidelity, it's a very pretty game, and it does exactly what it needs to do, being based on an original design similar to what the SNES had back then. So I've got to say, I was kind of oh, this is fun. Everything seems really cute. There's a lot of stuff there that's kind of fun seeing it as well, where you can tell this is based, because it is a remake, based on an old SNES game, because you have the walk off and on sort of where entrance and exits would be on a screen, and they kind of look the same. It's when you do isometric games, they have a very particular style and vibe to them, and this game very much continues that trend, all these years later. One thing that I think really sat well with me was the soundtrack, was a lot of the audio in the game in general. But I had never really listened to much of the soundtrack. Okay, I've heard Beware the Forest Mushrooms or whatever it's called. Apparently that was everyone's favourite from the original game, or one of anyway. But they've done awesome renditions of a lot of the tracks. Really cool that you can listen to both the original soundtrack in game or the modern soundtrack. I basically spent the entire time on the modern soundtrack, but I did switch it back and forth in a couple of places. I absolutely loved, I think the name of the track is And My Name Is Booster, when I got there. I'd never heard it before. It's this very jazz, almost going into sort of reggae territory, but there's very much this inspired jazz vibe for this guy's theme. It is amazing. I can't believe I've never heard it before. Super enjoyed that. There was other bits of music, some of the town themes, some of the battle themes and stuff that I just really got behind. Very much enjoyed that. Every area pretty much had its own tunes. Some of the dungeons and stuff had shared the same music, but for the most part, you were getting new music every area moving along. We'll talk about the actual gameplay of the game. So, like I said, it's an isometric game, which has its own problems. To be fair, platforming in this game is not the easiest thing to do. That definitely comes into play, especially later on near the end of the game, where it becomes quite frustrating, and that's probably one of the few times where I was oof. This is kind of not, I don't know if I would have designed some of these challenges this way, because it's quite difficult to do in a game that's isometric. Obviously, the good thing is Mario has a shadow underneath him, so you can kind of see where he's going to land, but it still doesn't mean it's easy to do. But the isometric view, you can run around I think the game was originally 8 directions. I think you can kind of force it in other directions now because it's a bit more free-flowing. Mario seems to move fairly well. But the big thing is obviously like the combat. So you have outside of combat is you running around, hitting your head on blocks like you'd expect, jumping on enemies, doing some puzzle platforming, doing some mini games, that sort of stuff. But the combat is where it's really at. And I will say I actually kind of like how Nintendo, in a lot of their RPGs, and this might be because this was made by Square, they might also have this, but they have a lot of these command abilities, which essentially are button presses and timings, both for defense and offense, so that you can reduce damage to 0, but you can also increase your damage to be critical hits and potentially hit all the other enemies. So the combat works like this. It's very standard, like it's all done on speed stats, so it'll be like, okay, your player characters have the highest speed, so they're all going to attack first. With Mario's normal attack, he punches. If you time it right, he'll punch twice. Time it perfectly, you get that critical hit thing. That's awesome, and then you go through the rest of your team. And then again, on the equivalent side, when you get attacked, if you time it perfectly when they hit you or about to hit you, you will block it and take no damage. And when you get good enough with the timing on a lot of these commands, it makes the game feel very powerful for one, but it also means you feel like a boss. There's a lot of learning, because every time you upgrade your character with a different weapon, they tend to get different attacks. So if Mario's got like the super glove or whatever it is, that's his punching attack, and then he might get something else entirely which completely changes his timing, like the hammer or something. Then you've got Mallow, Geno, Peach and Bowser, and they all have different attacks. Like Bowser can pick Mario up and chuck him, or he can use a chain chomp, for example, or he can punch. And then same with Geno, he might use like one style of gun, a different style of gun, and then different again. So you do have to kind of relearn the timing for all of these weapons and things as the game goes on. But that's kind of part of the charm, because you're like, well, like this gun does like plus 20 to attack. I want to use it. It's probably best that I learn it. And I was alright at it. There were some that I struggled with, because I was like, to start with, I wasn't quite getting the timing down. But the game does a really good job of putting up an exclamation point to tell you this is when you need to push the A button again to land that attack. When you start landing it, that goes away. If you start missing it like 3, 4, 5 times, they will bring it back for a few attacks so you can learn it again. So the game never like makes it too difficult, and that works with defending against attacks from the enemy as well. It will show you the timing to block it for 0 damage, then it will go away, and if you keep missing it, it will come back and try to help you. So it's kind of this like difficulty, like invisible difficulty setting that's like kind of active depending on how well or badly you're doing. But overall, the combat's really fun. You've got special moves, you've got items you can use in combat, you've then got triple attacks, which once you build up a bar in the corner, depending on who's equipped to your party, you'll do different things. It might be damage to a single target, to multiple targets, healing, protection. There's all these different things with the combinations you have, and that's really fun, and they got a nice little cutscene to them. But overall, it's a really nice, very fast-paced, for the most part, fast-paced combat system. There are some times where the enemies will use attacks you just can't block, and I think the way the game works is when you get good enough to block most of the attacks, you won't take damage. So they force some attacks that hit the entire party to be unblockable, or they'll be, they'll have other abilities and things that will just hit. Which is fine, because a lot of the time when you crit something, when you get good at that, you are hitting you'll hit the main target for 150 damage and everything else takes 50 damage. So you only have to hit some enemies a couple of times and then they're down. So it's an interesting balancing act between what the enemies can and can't do, and then what you can and can't do. I will say there was definitely things like, you've got fear, poison, or you can turn things into mushrooms, all these different abilities, where ultimately I didn't find that I needed to use fear and stuff. Like, you have a weakness list when you look at enemies, and they're all weak to different things. But I found with this game, pure power and damage was the way forward. Sometimes putting enemies to sleep was really useful, but for the most part, you could just power your way through, and it kind of null and voided a lot of that stuff. If you got really good with the timings on the special attacks, like Mario has a super jump and a fire flower move, and the other team, like, they have different abilities based on what you do. When you get really good at using those and find the enemy's weakness to those, like, that really makes a difference, and you can absolutely destroy bosses and things in this game. So you do feel fairly overpowered for the most part, and that's kind of how you feel right up until sort of the end of the game, where you start to have to really think about who you're using, what you're using, all that kind of stuff. But the combat for the most part is genuinely satisfying. the boss fights are probably the best thing about the game when it comes to that combat system, because you do have to think about what you're doing, what abilities you're using, what their weaknesses are, and like how much health they have, and work it out from there. The final boss in this game, like the actual main game, took me by surprise at how much of a difficulty spike it was, but it made me think, and I kind of enjoyed that. I was like, okay, what do I have to do here? What's the correct way of doing it? You have to learn to block these attacks or you're just going to die. All that good stuff. Talking about the difficulty of the game, I would say this game is fairly easy up until the second to last area, which is the volcano. You do the volcano area, which the enemies suddenly get a bit tougher and the boss fights are a little bit tougher. You then move to Bowser's Castle, and then you have Bowser's Castle and Smithy's World as like the last area, and that gets pretty tough. The final boss is difficult. The couple of boss fights before them, there's an area where you have to use these doors, and those sort of challenges become quite difficult. But up to that point, the game's fairly straightforward, and that might just be that I was quick at adapting with the counters and also with the attacks. So maybe I just found that the fights weren't that difficult, or it might just be from experience of playing RPGs and knowing when to use items and not hoarding them and just trying to smash my way through fights. But I definitely think that this game is on the easier side, and I think coupled with the fact that it is on a shorter side for an RPG as well, I kind of got to the end of the game and was like, oh, we've got a difficulty spike now, and then, then it was over. Which is fine. I don't think this game necessarily needs to be longer. Maybe a couple hours. There was, like I said, some stuff that I maybe missed. But overall, the best parts of the game are the boss fights. A lot of the enemies, once you kind of figure them out, not too bad. There are a couple of enemies I didn't really fully understand because I would kill them too quickly. But ultimately, this isn't like a difficult RPG. I wouldn't say it was that. The more difficulty trying to do the puzzles and trying to navigate on some of the puzzles and getting around where it is in an isometric view that can definitely throw people off. But if you wanted a nice straightforward RPG, once you start nailing those times to do critical hits, it sort of, the game becomes relatively, I won't say easy, like as in like, oh my god, this game's so easy. It's more just like, you just kind of like, okay, now I understand what I'm doing. I can get through the battles fine. And then, depending on how you are with someone with RPGs, you'll probably find that the mileage will go from being very easy to sort of normal. What else we got there? Oh, we got, in terms of enemies and stuff. Like there's a lot of enemies. You've got classic enemies from the Mario universe. You've got stuff that is obviously new to the game. You have like Shy Guys and Fly Guys and Koopa Troopers and Goombas and stuff. And then you've also got weird enemies like these weird like crabs, these weird like onions with a pitchfork. I don't know what they are. There's like a right old mix of enemies. They all do different things, as well as the boss fights. And I think the enemy variety was really cool. Way more in this game than I was expecting. But my favourite fights in the game, like I said, were the boss fights, and they come in different varieties. You have like the very first fight of the game is against Bowser, but that's more of a tutorial. But then you've got like Booster's fight, which is against probably more of a bigger cake. You have to fight this big cake, but which is weird. But you have that. You have all of Smithy's creations, like Speardovich, who's like this big spear guy, and this team of like what like a lack of a better way to describe them, like Power Rangers. They're all different colours. You have that fight. You have to fight a giant sword. You've got the manager, the director, all these different like characters you fight while you're in Smithy's world. A big tank, Smithy himself. An underwater fish guy. Like, they're all really interesting bosses. I actually really enjoyed the boss fights a lot. Very much enjoyed the fact that there was like, oh, they're not going to die in like 3 hits. I actually have to see what their attacks are, learn to dodge them, find out what their weaknesses are. If they don't have any, okay, cool. And then later on, once you've got the full party of characters, you can switch them in and out, and do setups and things like that. But I think the boss fights are generally really cool in this game. There's not one of them apart from the final boss fight. None of the ones before that were particularly difficult, but they were still more challenging than the regular enemies, which again would die, except for like the massive fat Koopa Troopers, which would take quite a beating. Most enemies died in about 2 to 3 hits, as long as you got the command normals on them. So, all in all, very much enjoyed that, the combat, along with the variety of enemies, along with the bosses. This game as a whole is fascinating to me now. It's very charming. There's a lot of good dialogue in it. It's very funny, and there's a lot of really cool like things that I didn't know about this game. Like I knew about, you have Bowser and Peach, and I knew about the Smithy and all that, but like characters like Booster and some like the Frog Sage and some of the other areas like you go to the Cloud Sky for Mallow, and all his mum and dad, and you have to fight Valentina and Dodo up there. There's a lot of like really fun moments in this game, some cute moments, and now having played it and also it not being a super long game, it's like, okay, this really kind of hit on the thing that I like about some RPGs. Not every RPG needs to be 100 hours long. Having one that's very contained. In the first sort of hour, you can have 3 or 4 of the stars already. You know, so you're spending a pretty quick time getting them. You're getting things at a rapid pace. It never really feels too rushed. But I think this is a really nice package with a good amount of gameplay in it for an RPG. And one of the really solid combat system. Great soundtrack. Great visuals. Like, this is a one-to-one remake in pretty much every sense of the word, with quality of life and some added endgame stuff, which I haven't even got to. That might be what I'm doing for when you're seeing the video for this. That might be what I'm doing. I'm not sure yet. But ultimately, like, this game is it's just really cool to be able to sit down and play it and have finished it. And finally, after all these years of a game that I didn't really like on the SNES, to now play this remake and be like, actually, this is a really fun game. There isn't much bad I can say about it other than it is maybe a little bit on the easier side, and that there is a bit at the end of the game where you go to Bowser's Castle that has these doors, and some of those challenges are just, like, the question challenges feel so harsh if you fail them, and some of the platforming being isometric is very tough as well. So there are elements of this game that you can see where it falls down because of the viewpoint, because it is a direct one-to-one, but the humor, the art style of the game, the music and audio, the actual combat and stuff, like, there's so much here, so much charm there, that I think this game is definitely worth picking up and playing if you haven't before. Obviously, if you've played the original and you haven't played the remake, I mean, likely you already have, but I can recommend this because it's just fun. Like, genuinely, like, some games are just fun, and this game feels it. No area outstays its welcome. You know, maybe you're in an area maybe each area in an hour, maybe less than that, sort of half an hour. The game has that nice pace, but if you haven't played it, I definitely recommend it. You can get this game in the UK for about £30, £30 to £35. If you can get it for that price, it's definitely worth it. Just be aware that it is a shorter experience, probably about 10 to 15 hours for the main story, depending on how well you do, and then however long, maybe another 5 hours for the post-game content. I know that those bosses, and there's a super boss in the game, are quite tough. I have yet to experience those, so we'll see. But ultimately, I think for that price, that's worth it for this game. You're going to have a very, very fun time, and genuinely just an experience of an RPG on a smaller scale. And I think that's going to be good for some people that don't want to put their time into a 100-hour game. So that's going to do it for me today then, guys. Thank you very much for watching. As always, if you like the video, hit like. If you want to see more content, hit subscribe. Links for Facebook and Twitter will be down below in the description as always. And until next video, I will see you then.